Imagine waking one November morning in the year 1002, only to hear your neighbors being dragged from their homes. Their screams tear through the cold air, their blood staining the streets. The killers? Not foreign raiders, not shadowy assassins, but their very own countrymen, acting on the orders of their king. This was the St. Brice's Day Massacre, one of the bloodiest betrayals in Anglo-Saxon England. But why would a king unleash slaughter on his own soil? And what dark consequences would follow? Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a tale of murder. It's a story of power, desperation, and a massacre that set England ablaze. But before we uncover the bloodshed of that cold November morning, we need to understand how the seeds of hatred were sown centuries before. For generations, the English had lived under the shadow of the Viking menace. They came first as shadows on the horizon, black dragon-prowed ships slicing through the mist. Monks at Lindisfarne were the first to feel the terror. Their sacred halls were plundered, their holy texts trampled, their blood spilled on church floors. And the raids did not stop. Wave after wave of Norse warriors poured into England, not content with gold or silver. They sought land, dominion, and a permanent claim to the island itself. Soon, vast swathes of England, the Danelaw, were carved into Viking territory. Towns spoke in strange accents. Markets rang with Norse coin. Pagan gods once whispered in the same fields where Christian bells tolled. To some Saxons, the Danes were invaders, merciless killers who brought fire and ruin. To others, they became neighbors, even kin. Trade grew, marriages bound bloodlines. And yet, the memory of the sword never faded. Every harvest, every festival, every birth carried the shadow of suspicion. The lines between Dane and Saxon blurred, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered, ancient, unhealed, and waiting for a spark. The English had never forgotten the terror of the raids, and the Danes, proud and unyielding, never saw themselves as guests. And by the year 1002, these tensions were about to explode in a way no one could have imagined. But who would light the fuse? And why would the king gamble with blood to save his throne? On the throne sat King Æthelred, forever remembered as the Unready. Yet the word did not mean lazy or unfit. It came from the Old English unrad, ill-advised. His downfall was not weakness of body, but weakness of counsel, surrounded by men who whispered conflicting strategies, leaving him paralyzed by hesitation. His reign was haunted by a single, unrelenting specter, the Vikings. Time and again their ships returned, dragon prows rising like omens on the horizon. To fend them off, Æthelred paid what became known as Danegeld, a tribute of gold wrung from his people's toil, handed to the very marauders who bled his kingdom. Each time, the Vikings promised peace. Each time, the peace was broken. The people began to murmur, what kind of king buys survival instead of defending it? Could Æthelred shield his kingdom, or was he merely postponing its doom? Each raid that followed deepened the sense of betrayal. Each coin paid made England weaker, while the Viking armies grew richer, stronger, bolder. By the dawn of the 11th century, Æthelred stood cornered, mocked by history, mistrusted by his people, and encircled by an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. By 1002, Æthelred was desperate. A plan began to form, one that would wipe the slate clean in a single brutal stroke. And so, on the feast day of St. Brice, the king issued a decree drenched in blood. November 13th, 1002. A royal decree spread across England. The king ordered the extermination of all Danes living in his realm. Not just raiders or mercenaries, men, women, children, neighbors who had lived side by side with the English for years. The massacre was meant to purge the land of those in England Æthelred feared were conspiring with enemies abroad. But this was no surgical strike. It was a nationwide slaughter. The stage was set for one of the darkest days in Anglo-Saxon history. But what did that bloodbath look like on the ground? And who would survive to tell the tale? In Oxford, the story is written in ash and agony. The Danes fled to the church, clinging to the ancient promise of sanctuary. They believed holy walls would shield them from the king's wrath. But Æthelred's decree was merciless. The doors were sealed, barred from the outside. Torches hurled against the wood. Within minutes, the sanctuary became a furnace. Inside, men, women, and children cried out, not for vengeance, but for mercy. Their voices faded beneath the roar of flames. The walls collapsed, and with them, the lives of dozens who once called England their home. Across the realm, scenes no less horrific unfolded. In villages and towns, neighbors who once traded bread and shared ale turned executioners overnight. Some struck with zeal, convinced they were purging traitors. Others did so with trembling hands, driven by fear of royal punishment if they disobeyed. And what makes this horror most chilling is its banality. It was not faceless soldiers alone who carried out the killings. It was ordinary men carrying out the king's order, watching as communities they once shared dissolved into fire and blood. The massacre was not just killing, it was betrayal, an entire people branded as enemies overnight. But was the king's brutal gamble worth it? Or had Æthelred just unleashed a storm that England could not contain? Historians still debate the true scale of the killings. Was it ethnic cleansing, a cold attempt to erase the Danes from English soil? Or was it limited, only targeting Danish leaders and warriors suspected of treason? The truth may never be fully known, but archaeology offers clues. In 2008, beneath St. John's College, Oxford, a pit of 37 young men was unearthed. Charred bones, cut marks, skulls smashed by axes. Forensic analysis revealed they were of Scandinavian origin. The massacre was no myth. Its victims still whisper their story from the grave. And if the massacre was meant to secure England's safety, it had the opposite effect. Because across the sea, a king heard the cries of his slaughtered kin, and he vowed vengeance. When news of the massacre reached Denmark, fury boiled into a vow of vengeance. Among the dead, it was said, was a woman of noble blood, Gunhild, sister of King Sweyn Forkbeard. Whether fact or legend, her death gave the Vikings a personal reason to strike back with fire and fury. Sweyn wasted no time. Raids that had once been intermittent now came with unrelenting brutality. English villages burned, crops were torched, livestock stolen, survivors were dragged into slavery. What had once been an attempt to erase the Danes from England instead brought the full weight of their wrath upon it. And Æthelred, desperate as ever, fell back on the same failing tactic: Danegeld. More gold was scraped from the coffers of his kingdom, handed over in humiliating tribute. But each payment only emboldened Sweyn further. Finally, in 1013, Sweyn came not as a raider, but as a conqueror. His fleets darkened the seas. His armies marched deep into the heart of England. Town after town yielded without resistance. Æthelred, the king who had ordered the slaughter, fled across the Channel into exile. The crown of England, his crown, now rested in Danish hands. The massacre meant to save England had only delivered it into Viking hands. But the story doesn't end with fire and steel. Centuries later, the earth itself would unearth the massacre's darkest secrets. Centuries later, the earth itself betrayed the silence. Excavations in Oxford uncovered pits of charred bones, men, women, even children. The skeletons bore the unmistakable signs of violence. Skulls crushed as if by heavy blows, ribs split by blades, jawbones scorched black with fire. Some were still barely grown, teenagers caught in the storm of vengeance. This was no battlefield, no clash of armies. What lay beneath the soil spoke of something colder. Captives herded together, half defenseless, cut down and burned where they stood. It was not war, but execution. Forensic reconstructions breathed uncanny life back into the victims. Human faces, once erased by flame and hatred, re-emerged through science. Their presence asks a question no record can silence. Who remembers them, and who was meant to forget? The massacre, whispered about in chronicles, became undeniable fact. The land of England had kept the truth buried, waiting for centuries, until spades and brushes revealed the cruelty etched into bone. The massacre was real. Its ghosts remain. But how do we remember such horror? Do we call it justice or betrayal? The massacre did not erase the Danes. Instead, it paved the way for their domination. Within a generation, King Cnut, son of Sweyn, would rule England itself, creating a North Sea empire. Ironically, the very people Æthelred tried to destroy became England's rulers. The massacre had failed, but its shadow lingered, etched into chronicles as a warning of where desperation leads. The massacre's legacy was not victory, but proof of a kingdom's fragility. And the chroniclers who recorded it asked the question we must still ask today. What drives a ruler to turn his sword inward? In the centuries that followed, the massacre was never forgotten, yet never agreed upon. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of it in starkly different lights. To some, it was divine justice, a cleansing of heathen presence from a Christian land. To others, it was a stain upon England's soul, a cruelty so needless that it invited the very vengeance it feared. Modern historians struggle with the same questions. Was this an act of raw ethnic hatred, branding every Dane, farmer, mother, child, as an enemy? Or was it cold political calculation, a desperate king striking a blow he hoped would unify a fractured realm? Æthelred the Unready has long been painted as weak, cowardly, incapable of leading. But here we glimpse another side, a man cornered, terrified, and willing to gamble everything in blood. His decision left scars not just in bone and ash, but in the memory of a nation. The massacre leaves us not with answers, but with haunting questions. And that is why the story of the Viking massacres in Northumbria still matters today, because it asks us, across 1,000 years, how fear can twist into violence and how power can turn neighbor into executioner. The St. Brice's Day massacre was not just a moment of bloodshed, it was a turning point. A desperate act that reshaped the destiny of a kingdom and left ghosts whispering beneath the soil of England. History is not only about battles won and crowns worn. It is about betrayals, desperation, and the human cost of power. If this story has gripped you, give this video a like. It helps us bring more hidden histories to light. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss the dark truths we uncover here. And when you're ready, watch the next video on your screen, where we dive into another tale of murder, deceit, and betrayal that history tried to bury.